The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, Lord.
Jesus told a parable to his disciples. Can one blind man guide another? Surely both will fall into a pit. The disciple is not superior to his teacher. The fully trained disciple will always be like his teacher. Why do you observe the splinter in your brother's eye and never notice the plank in your own? How can you say to your brother, brother, let me take the splinter out of your eye, when you cannot see the plank in your own? Hypocrite, take the plank out of your own eye first, and then you will see clearly enough to take out the splinter that's in your brother's eye. There is no sound tree that produces rotten fruit, nor again a rotten tree that produces sound fruit. For every tree can be told by its fruit. People do not pick figs from thorns, nor gather grapes from brambles. A good man draws what is good from the store of goodness in his heart. A bad man draws what is bad from the store of badness. For a man's words flow out of what fills his heart. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Today we have the third part in our three-part on the Sermon of the Plain. And remember, it started with the Beatitudes, and Luke has 4 Beatitudes. And then last week, that text on love. That text, love your enemies, do good to them, pray for them. That we are called not to be a people who only like those who like us, but to love those who are not in favor of us, or who might choose to be our enemies, or who might make themselves our enemies. Today we have the third part of it, of the text. And whereas the first part gives the pathway to happiness, and the second part tells you what we must be doing, the third part tells you how to evaluate yourself and how to understand the depth of your own discipleship. You know, when we started the triptych, I said, if ever you felt that you were getting a little bit holy, and you felt, you were doing really good on the spiritual life, that you should read the Sermon on the Plain. Just read it once and meditate on it, and we would dispel those illusions very quickly. Because the sermon really gets at the very heart of the human. And at our very core and heart, we are in need of God's mercy. That's it. We cannot be good on our own volition. Without God's grace, we cannot grow in virtue. Without grace, we cannot become great human beings. That we are in need of God's mercy. It starts by telling us that Jesus told a parable to his disciples. And that's interesting, because what flows are just little sayings. But the text calls them a parable, a riddle, or a saying that has a meaning that you have to ponder it. And he starts, can one blind man guide another? Well, it's a rhetorical question, huh? Because the image that you have is 2 blind people walking down Frederick Street and not seeing where the potholes are, or where the motor car is coming, or where the danger is lurking. That's the image. But this image is taken and transformed from the physical world into the inner world. So it's saying, don't presume to guide somebody in the life of grace and in the life of virtue if you yourself are blind. Serious business, Don't presume to be a guide if you yourself are blind. In other words, until you have sight, you can't guide another person to virtue, to holiness, and to Christ. And this text is a very troubling text. I should have said to you about your seat belts, but you all know the drill already, so I ain't worried to say nothing. I'm not saying nothing. And it goes on, surely both will fall into a pit. And the pit in the external world will be a pothole on Frederick Street. The pit in the internal world is that because they are blind, they will not see the truth, and they will not see how even in their emotion or in their devotion, how they go astray, because blindness is a funny thing. So too in the physical world, so too in the spiritual world. And he's really speaking about spiritual blindness. Several times in the gospel, Jesus would have a healing of a blind person. And right next to it, have a chastisement of a Pharisee and say to them, blind, if you could see, it would be okay. If you were blind, it would be okay. But because you say you can see, your damnation is even greater. And so Jesus speaks about blindness not as a physical ailment, but as a spiritual odyssey, a spiritual ailment that is difficult to be healed from. Because first, before you can be healed from spiritual blindness, you have to know first that you are blind yourself. You have to first know that you are blind. And that self-knowledge is what the text is getting us to. That self-knowledge. You know, he goes on to say, the disciple is not superior to his teacher. The disciple is not superior to his teacher. So remember, he's addressing this parable to his disciples. The disciple is not superior to his teacher. You know, there were times when James and John wanted to burn down fire on a village because they didn't want to hear what Jesus had to say. And in their enthusiasm for Christ, they wanted to use violence. The disciple is not superior to his teacher. The disciple is the one who is still learning. And the text is addressed to all of us. We are all disciples of Jesus Christ. We should consider ourselves still learning about what is required to follow Jesus Christ. And if we consider ourselves as still learning to follow him, then we will consider that every day we are in the business of growing in our learning to follow him. He goes on to say the fully trained disciple will always be like his teacher. And this is ironic, huh? Because if the teacher is bad, so too the disciple will be bad. If the teacher is good, so too the disciple will be good. If the teacher is a holy person, a wise person, so too the disciple will be a holy and a wise person. If the teacher is blind themselves and not seeing their own arrogance, not seeing their pride, not seeing all of their own defects, so too will the disciple be formed like the teacher. And so it's a kind of ironic twist he's giving us here. And then in case you miss that irony, he gives us a funny one. He says, why do you observe the splint in your brother's eye and never notice the plank in your own? How can you say to your brother, brother, let me take the splinter out of your eye, when you cannot see the plank in your own? You ever took a splinter out of somebody's eye? They got a little dust or something in their eye, and you had to hold the eye open, and you had to blow and blow until it moves, and then it comes down to the side, and you could kind of get it out of the eye, because it's really irritable when the splinter is in somebody's eye. Huh? You ever had a little dust or something in your eye, and somebody had to you had to hold it open and blow on, you know? You ever had that? Okay. Now imagine somebody trying to do that when in their eye there's a plank. Now a plank is usually about 12 feet long. So from their eye to that post, all there is this big piece of a 12-inch board by 2-inch board coming straight out of your eye, and you trying to get close enough to the other person to try and take a splinter out of theirs. It's a very funny image. It's meant to provoke humor and to provoke irony. That sometimes, you know, we see so clearly, so clearly the sins of another person. And sometimes we just can't see. Help me now. Ourselves. Sometimes. You know, this part of the teaching is a tough one. It's a tough teaching. Because what we tend to do is we are very critical when we see faults in other people. Not so? And we're very critical. When we see the same faults in ourselves, we're very merciful. Help me now. True or not true? That makes sense to you? Somebody say yes. You see, how it should work is the opposite. We should be very merciful when we see faults in other people. And we should be very critical when we see those same faults in ourselves. Why? Because when we give ourselves a lie and excuse ourselves, it means that we are not serious about becoming a disciple. We're not serious about growth in virtue. We're not serious about the life of grace. We're not serious about following Jesus Christ. We're not serious about doing the work of discipleship that He's called us to, and therefore we're choosing to be a blind guide. We're choosing to be a blind guide. And we're very permissive with ourselves. But let somebody else do half of what we did now. Let them do a little half of it. We go to tongue on them. We ramage like a pico plat. We carry on them. And we're terribly hard in our judgments. Human nature is a funny thing, you don't find? Because that's blindness, That right there, that is blindness. It's blindness to be hard on somebody else but excusing of yourself. That's just blindness. Because it means that you are setting one standard for people and a lower standard for yourself. That's just blindness. And that kind of blindness leads us to be waffly in our discipleship. And waffling our discipleship leads us to be people who are like blind guides leading people down the road, falling into pits because we just can't see them ourselves. You know, the greatest saints consider themselves to be terrible sinners. St. Therese of Lisieux, young woman, 24 years old when she died, entered the convent at 15 years old. And she considered herself to be the worst of all sinners. The worst of sinners. But I suppose the opposite is true too. The greatest sinners often consider themselves to be very big saints. The opposite is true. Because they're blind and can't see the truth. You see, the saints are the ones, because they draw very close to Christ, they see what we are not seeing. They see how the little offenses of our own hearts, how they impact the relationship with their God, and how they're making us less than we are called to be by him, and therefore it affects the way in which we love him, and therefore it's a terrible offense, small as it might be to other people. To the saint, it's a huge offense because it really disrupts the love between us and God. The great saints have spiritual sight to see the truth about God, and because they could see the truth about God, they recognize in themselves the deep depth of despair and the deep depth of sinfulness that we have. And theirs is a passage from Romans 7. Who can save me from this body doomed to sin and destruction? And then Romans 8, Paul says, thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord, who has saved us from death. Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord, who has saved us from death. The great saints experience the depth of their own unworthiness. And that's because they have spiritual sight. I had an uncle, he often said, oh, for the gift you give us, to see ourselves as others see us. Have you ever been shocked to hear how people think about you? Huh? Come on now. You ever overhear people talking about you, and you shocked, that's how they think about me? Huh? Big shock. You see, that's part of our blindness. It's part of our blindness, that we don't see what others see about us. And so we see what we see, but what others see about us, that we just go blind on that. And because we go blind on that, we are not in a position of transformation, of discipleship, of becoming a better human being, of deepening our relationship with Jesus Christ, of going to our knees and begging God for mercy, of recognizing that without God's grace, we cannot change this stubborn and sinful heart of ours. We cannot change it on our own. We're in a time of Synod this time in our church. And this is a beautiful text for Synod. Because even as church, we don't see our own faults as church. We don't see the ways that we have hurt people. Huh? We don't see the ways that we have treated people badly, or sometimes our own attitudes that we justify ourselves in ends up looking judgmental and condemning to people. We don't see sometimes the way that as church we are cliquish, and we have an in-clique, and you can't get past that in-clique. And if you come in and you're trying to serve or trying to help, that you're not taken seriously because you are not part of that in-clique. We don't see sometimes as church that in our judgment of peoples and our harsh language that we justify ourselves because we have to correct people and point them the way of truth. That in itself turns people away from Christ, from his church, from us. And that's why this time of Synod is so important. And it's important that in this time of Synod that we do the listening with a very open and humble heart. We're going to hear things we don't want to hear. But one thing a maxim I always say, the truth is the truth. The truth can't be good or bad. It just is. Because whether you like it or you don't like it, the truth is the truth. And then on the other side, people's perspectives are people's perspectives. You can't change that. But not knowing, not listening, not being available to the perspective of other people does not help us to grow as church. And so this time of Synod listening is a time where, as church, we we really recognize that we have planks in our eyes, that sometimes we are blind guides, that sometimes we've got it really wrong, and we're groping and grappling to be disciples of Christ. And as we listen to others and their perspective, it will help us to be better disciples. It will help us to clear some of that blindness that we have, and help us to see more clearly what the truth is of people's perception of us, and maybe too what the truth is of Jesus' perception of us. The Synod is a call to deep interiority and deep conversion of heart. And it's not something that we do and we say, okay, we're done, next. It's something that we do as a journey of discipleship, as a journey of transformation, as a journey of seeking the truth from God. And so as we enter into this synodal time, we recognize just how fragile we are, but we also recognize how gracious God is, how merciful God is, and that if we come to God with humble hearts, God will lead us all of the way to his kingdom, all of the way. And so it's not a time of fear and trepidation. It's a time of excitement and grace, because there are opportunities here for us as church to really grow and flourish and become so much better than we are right now. So as we enter into this synodal time, make sure and allow your voice to be heard. Make sure and allow your perspective to be heard. Our text ends with, there's no sound tree that produces rotten fruit, nor again a rotten tree that produces sound fruit. For every tree can be told by its fruit. At the end of the day, what Jesus is saying here is, by your actions, we will know your heart. By your actions, we will know your heart. By your actions, we will know your heart. Because a good tree produces good fruit. A good person produces good actions. A good person produces good words. And that's our first reading, talking about understanding the depth of a person by the words that they say. Was the ending of this reading, which says, for man's words flow out of what fills his heart. And really, the journey of Christianity is not to look like a Christian, which we have spent so much energy on sometimes. It's actually to be a Christian from deep in our hearts, outwards. The real energy comes from inside the heart. And brothers and sisters, we can't change our own hearts, but God can change them. God can change them. What we have to do is grow in some spiritual sight to recognize how hard our heart is, how resistant it is to God, how resistant our heart is to the things of God, and then come before God begging for the grace of conversion of heart, and God will do what God will do in our hearts. But if we don't see what we need, then we don't beg God, we don't recognize, we don't expect, we don't ask God. And then our hearts stay cold, hard, and close to God and other people. And we don't find the healing that we need. In this time, as we enter into Lent, let us really pray and ask God to do a work in our hearts. Do a work in our hearts and renew our hearts. Amen.